Chapter 1. The Graves Torn Open. By the time Borin Clarkson came to Middenhoff Hollow, the town already smelled like a thing half dead. Not the honest stink of dung heaps and tannery runoff, nor even the sour reek of cheap ale sweated through wool by men too poor to wash. This was a sweeter smell, a thicker one. Rot under rain, old meat in wet soil, the scent of churchyards disturbed and opened before their proper time. It drifted through the lanes in clammy breaths whenever the wind came down from the hill where the cemetery sat, and every dog in town had learned to whine when it did. Middenhoff Hollow crouched in a fold of sterland like a beggar huddled in a ditch, all sagging roofs, mud-slick lanes, and leaning timber houses blackened by damp. The place had likely been ugly in summer. In late autumn, under a sky the color of old bruises, it was a pit. Rain dripped from every eave. Water gathered in the cart ruts and shone like oil. The woods beyond the fields were a wall of skeletal branches and pale mist, and crows sat in them like lumps of burnt cloth. Borin entered at noon, and it looked like dusk. He came in by the south road with a pack on his shoulders, a broad-bladed axe looped across his back, and a brace of pistols under his coat. He was shorter than the humans, but wider across the chest than most of them were across the hips, and he moved with the grim, deliberate weight of a creature carved from older, harder stone. Rain beaded in his beard rings. His left ear was half gone from some old cut. A puckered scar ran from the corner of his brow into the bristle of his hairline. He had the look common to many dwarfs of the road, battered, self-contained, and permanently one insult from violence. He had come hunting men, not monsters. A band of river road thieves had cut a merchant train east of Würtbad, and Borin had tracked two of the bastards this far before losing sign in the churn of autumn mud. He wanted a warm stable, a bowl of something greasy, and perhaps a loose tongue in a tavern. Instead, he found the whole town staring at him as if he were a priest come to walk on water. They watched from doorways and shutters. A butcher with blood to the elbows stopped chopping and simply stood there, cleaver in hand. A woman hauling turnips crossed herself when she saw him. Two children under a cart blinked up with hollow eyes and fled so fast one lost a shoe in the muck. "Cheery folk," Borin muttered. The tavern was called the Soot and Tallow, which told him all he needed to know about the standards of the place. Its signboard hung crooked, showing a candle stub painted with the sort of enthusiasm one normally reserved for funerals. Inside, the common room was warm in the way diseased flesh was warm. Damp, smoky, crowded, and not right. Men drank without speaking much. Women sat stiff-backed, hands around cups gone cold. Every face had that same stretched look, as if sleep had become expensive. Borin had 2 steps through the door before someone said, too loudly, "That's a dwarf." The room turned to look at him. He hated that. Hated the naked weighing up of human eyes, the quick hope, the quicker stupidity. He stamped mud from his boots and made for the ale. The innkeeper, a bald man with a sweating upper lip, poured with shaking hands. "You're armed." "I leave the harp at home when I travel," Borin said. A few nervous laughs came and died. The innkeeper slid the cup over. "Begging your pardon, Master Dwarf. It's only well. There's trouble. There's always trouble. A graveyard sort." That silenced even the little scraping noises of cups on wood. Borin drank. The ale tasted of bitter roots and dirty barrel. What sort? A woman stood from the far table before the innkeeper could answer. She was hard-faced, broad-shouldered, and built like someone who had buried more than one husband and learned from each occasion. Her hair, once black perhaps, was going iron grey. She wore widow's plain wool and had a skinning knife at her belt. "Don't prattle around it, Janik," she said. "Tell it plain. The dead are being dug up." That got Borin's attention in spite of himself. He lowered the cup. The woman came closer. Coffins split open. Bodies chewed to the bone. Not all at once. A hand one night, a rib cage the next. Like something's feeding slow and mean. Last week, old Thomas boy found his grandmother's headstone tipped over and her grave hollow beneath. No corpse left, only hair and teeth. The innkeeper swallowed, and the goat pens by the cemetery wall. Something took 3 goats, opened them up and left the guts steaming. One of the Mauer girls says she saw shapes on the mausoleums. Another voice put in. Pale things, crouched there in the rain. Children see ghosts when the wind shifts. She pissed herself and wouldn't speak for a day. The room began to murmur. Fear wanted telling. Borin saw it happen in their faces. Once the first crack formed, the whole rotten barrel burst. Graves opened, dogs vanishing. Scratching under the churchyard after dark. Mud on the crypt doors in handprints too long for any man. A coffin dragged halfway across consecrated ground. Bells heard at midnight though no one had pulled the rope. And then, at last, the thing that was really on their minds. "You're a dwarf," said the widow. "You'll not scare easy." Borin turned his head slowly toward her. "What did you say?" "You heard me." I heard. I was deciding whether to be insulted once or twice. That almost made her smile. "You can be insulted after you take the coin." He studied her. There was no fawning in her, no silly belief that a beard and broad shoulders made a miracle worker. Only desperation sharpened into usefulness. He respected that more than the rest of the room combined. "What's your name, woman?" "Magdariv." "Vido?" "Huh, yes. Anyone in this town not one?" he asked. A few people flinched, as if struck. "Good," he thought. "Let them." Magda set a leather purse on the table before him. It clinked thinly. "Look at the graves. Tell us what's doing it. If it's men, kill them. If it's beasts, kill them. If it's worse—" She shrugged. "You're armed." Borin nudged the purse with one thick finger. Not much in it. Likely gathered from the whole town by scraping the bottoms of boxes and sewing kits. He should have laughed and sent them to their own watchman. Instead, he drank the last of the ale and said, "Show me." The cemetery stood on the hill above Middenhoff Hollow, ringed by a low wall of dark stone green with moss and split by roots. Beyond it rose the church of Moor, squat and old, with its crow motifs black against the rain and its small bell tower like a watching fist. The graveyard itself sprawled around the church in ranks of leaning stones, weather-eaten crypts, and family mausoleums with cracked angel statuary that looked more like starved women than heavenly guardians. Even in daylight, it had the look of a place that wanted no visitors. The mud between the graves was churned by many boots. Borin crouched by the first torn plot and pushed aside the boards laid over it by frightened townsmen. Wet earth slumped inward. The coffin beneath had burst. The lid was not pried up but split jaggedly from below. Planks bowed and snapped outward. Inside lay tatters of winding cloth and the dark stain where flesh had liquefied months ago. A femur gnawed at both ends, rested in the muck like a discarded marrow bone. Borin picked it up and turned it in his hand. Not shovel work, not robbers after jewelry. Teeth had done this. Many teeth. Long incisors, rough and crowded, scraping without care. He moved on. The second grave was the same, though older. The third had been opened from above, but only after something had already broken into the coffin from beneath. There were claw-scored marks on the inner wood, mud packed in the dead woman's hair. A child's grave had been dug into and then abandoned halfway through, as if whatever tunneled there had changed its mind or found richer meat elsewhere. Borin's face darkened. "Who buried these?" he asked. A skinny grave digger in a soaked cap raised a hand. "Me and my brother, mostly. Did you notice subsidence? Hollows in the ground? Soft patches?" The man blinked. "What? Did the earth sink under your boots, you half-wit?" "A bit, maybe. Near the old crypt hill." "Why didn't you say so?" The gravedigger looked honestly bewildered. "To who?" Borin spat into the mud. He walked the cemetery perimeter, slow and deliberate, reading sign where human eyes had seen only horror. Here, a scuffed patch beneath yew roots, where something had hauled itself over the wall. There, a faint rake of claws on mortar. At the far end of the grounds, near a row of sunken mausoleums, he found a stink strong enough to make even him wrinkle his nose. A slab had shifted in the hillside behind one of the larger crypts. Not far, just enough for rainwater and the sweet, foul breath of corruption to seep through. Brambles had been torn aside recently. In the muck beneath lay prints. Not wolf, not dog, hands, almost. Long-fingered, narrow-palmed, ending in hooked nails that dug deep into the clay. There were many of them, crossing and recrossing. "Something used this place often," Borin grunted, and drew one pistol. He crouched, jammed the barrel under the edge of the shifted stone, and heaved. The slab moved with a grinding groan and exposed a black gap breathing Midden stink into the rain. Inside was a shaft descending into old darkness. Once it had likely been a charnel drop, some forgotten place for bones and plague dead, when Middenhoff Hollow had been richer and more crowded. Now its stone throat had partly collapsed. Rotten beams jutted from packed earth. Threads of grave cloth hung from nails. The walls were smeared with old filth and newer grease. At the bottom of the shaft, barely visible, was a mound of refuse. Borin took the lantern from the gravedigger without asking and climbed down. The shaft narrowed halfway. Twice, the old masonry shifted under his weight. He descended with a dwarf's care, feet testing every hold, shoulders brushing stone slick as wet skin. When he reached the bottom, the lantern light crawled over the heap and made several of the watching humans above cry out. It was a Midden, indeed. Bones, hundreds of them, human and animal mixed together in a foul white tangle. Shreds of burial cloth, splintered coffin boards, broken rosaries, gnawed skulls with the jaws torn off, rusted rings, hair clotted in mud, a child's shoe, the carcass of a goat, opened from throat to groin, and black with flies despite the cold. Filth had been piled there in layers, old and new, until the whole pit had become a nest of consumption. Borin crouched by a skull and ran his thumb over the bites. He had seen cave ghouls before, years ago in the eastern hills, after a greenskin siege drove worse things out of deeper holes. These marks were not dissimilar. There was the same impatient savagery, the same cracking of bone for marrow, the same diseased enthusiasm, in the way every scrap had been worried and reopened and chewed again. But those things had been wild. This place was trafficked, used, organized. He found a scrap of black cloth, not from a grave shroud, but from a priest's wrapping sheet, the kind used to cover the dead before rites. Found a body bag cord neatly cut rather than torn. Found, tucked among the rubbish, a fragment of candle wax, still clean and pale. Someone had come down here, with the dead arranged for delivery. When he climbed back out, the priest was waiting. Father Halvard Voss stood under a black umbrella held by a church boy, his robes dark with rain around the hem. He was tall for a human, narrow-faced, with a skull-like gauntness that might have suited a priest of Moor under better circumstances. But there was something damp and strained in him now. His eyes moved too quickly. His hands were folded too tightly within his sleeves. "This place is consecrated," Voss said. "Whatever must be done, it should be done with reverence." Borin handed the lantern back and wiped grave filth from his fingers onto the priest's umbrella. "Your reverence is being eaten." A few townsfolk choked back ugly laughs. Voss ignored them. The dead belong to Moor. Disturbance and panic will only dishonor them further. The graves should be closed. Prayers said. The cemetery left to holy keeping. Borin looked at him. "Holy keeping has holes in it." The priest's jaw tightened. "There is evil everywhere in these lands. Men grow fanciful. A few scavenging beasts. Beasts don't split coffins from below and sort refuse into feeding pits. That shut him up for a heartbeat. Only a heartbeat. Then perhaps grave robbers with feral dogs. There are desperate men abroad, fallen soldiers, brigands, plague scavengers." "I'm chasing brigands," Borin said. "Brigands steal boots. They don't gnaw femurs." Voss stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Master Dwarf, I ask only that you do not inflame matters. The town is frightened. We have endured bad harvests, fever, and river bandits this year already. People need calm, not blood-mad rumors in a churchyard." Borin smelled stale incense under the priest's wet wool, and under that, fear. Not the fear of a shepherd hearing wolves, the fear of a debtor seeing the lender arrive. He leaned in until the priest had to meet his eyes. "Then you'll not mind me finding what's under your hill." For the first time, Father Voss failed to school his face quickly enough. Something flickered there. Not surprise. Not exactly. Recognition, perhaps. A tightening, like a man who hears a barred door rattle at midnight. Then it was gone. "As you wish," the priest said. "But the dead are under Moor's protection." Borin bared his teeth in something no one mistook for a smile. "Then Moor can share." The rain thickened toward evening, turning from drizzle to a hard slanting downpour that rattled the church slates and washed the graveyard into black mire. By sunset most of the town had barred their shutters. No bells rang for vespers. No mourners climbed the hill. Middenhoff hollow huddled below like a kicked cur. Borin made his preparations in a mausoleum whose owners were too dead to object. He checked the edge on his axe until it would shave hair from skin. He primed both pistols and set them within easy reach. He wrapped the lantern so only a slit of light escaped. Then he settled into the darkness behind a cracked sarcophagus and waited. Waiting was work. Humans never understood that. They thought courage was shouting and charging, not sitting still while cold water slid down your spine, and every old tunnel instinct told you something below had begun to move. Night came early and mean. The churchyard grew strange with it. Shapes lengthened. Statues seemed to turn their faces. Rain drummed on stone and soil alike, until all lesser noises vanished into its hiss. Once a shutter banged somewhere in town, and Borin's hand closed on a pistol butt by reflex. Another time, something scraped in the dark beyond the wall, and he caught himself leaning forward, breath slow, eyes narrowed. Then, near midnight, the ground answered, a tremor first, so slight another man might have missed it. The muddy floor of the mausoleum quivered beneath his boots. One of the nearby headstones gave a tiny knocking jerk. Then came a sound from outside, masked by the storm until it was almost upon him. A wet, patient scratching. Borin rose without hurry and moved to the shattered doorway. Across the graveyard, perhaps 30 paces off, a family tomb with a cracked dome roof sat half-sunk in the hill. He had marked it earlier. The floor within had sagged badly. Now he saw why. The stone flags inside the tomb shifted. One lifted a finger's breadth, dropped, lifted again. Mud fountained through the seams. Thin black fingers slid up into the rain, clawing for purchase. They were too long, too jointed. The nails were yellow hooks. With dreadful care, something hauled itself upward. It came into view in pieces. A bald scalp slick with filth, shoulders narrow as a corpse's, and roped with wiry muscle. Arms so long the knuckles brushed the floor. Its skin was corpse-pale under the mud, stretched tight over a body that had once perhaps been human and had gone a long way past it. The mouth was the worst part too wide, lipless, the gums dark, the teeth needled and crowded. It sniffed the rain like an animal tasting blood in the air. In one hand it gripped a dead man by the ankle. The corpse wore a burial shirt gone brown with damp. The other leg thudded over the stone as the creature dragged it toward the opening. It moved with obscene economy, no wasted motion, all tendon and hunger. When the dead weight snagged, it did not strain like a man, but jerked once, brutally, and a body slid after it. Borin raised one pistol. Before he could fire, another shape moved above. He saw it on the church spire. A second creature crouched among the black stone crows beneath the bell, long-limbed and still as carved blasphemy. Rain slicked its back. Its head turned with a bird-like hitch, and in the dark its eyes caught the lantern glow leaking from Borin's mausoleum slit. They shone yellow, not animal, not witless, watching. For one long moment, the graveyard held its breath around them, the dwarf in shadow, the corpse thief at the tomb, the sentinel on the spire, while storm water ran red-brown through opened graves. Then the watcher smiled, showing all its teeth, and the bells above it began to tremble, though no human hand had touched the rope. Chapter 2. Beneath the crypts, morning came to Middenhoff hollow, like a bruise spreading under skin. No sunrise broke the clouds. There was only a slow graying of the sky over the town, a thin dead light filtering through rain and chimney smoke until the streets and rooftops emerged from darkness, looking no improved by it. The church bell had not rung since midnight. No one had climbed the graveyard hill after what some claimed they had heard in the storm scratching on stone, a bell trembling without a hand to pull it, an animal shriek that was not any animal they knew. The townsfolk kept behind shutters and door bars, peering through cracks as if the very air outside might bite. Borin Clagson did not sleep. He had left the cemetery before dawn, with grave mud to the knees, powder smoke in his beard, and the image of those yellow eyes still lodged in his head like a splinter. He had not fired the first pistol after all. The corpse thief vanished too quickly, dropping through the split tomb floor with its burden in a blur of pale limbs and gravecloth, while the thing on the church spire leapt away into the storm before he had a clean shot. He had cursed himself for that restraint, then cursed himself again for knowing it had likely saved his life. A tunnel hunter who fired on the first movement often died to the second. Now he stood at the foot of the crypt hill with a coil of rope over one shoulder, a shuttered lantern at his hip, both pistols reloaded, and a leather satchel of blasting powder hanging heavy against his thigh. His axe rested across his back. He had borrowed 2 crowbars, a sledge, and a pry iron from the smith, who handed them over without argument and crossed himself 3 times after. The graveyard loomed above him, soaked black by rain. The Church of Moor sat in its midst, like a squat carrion crow with folded wings. No one had come to offer holy counsel this morning. Father Halvard Voss had sent only word, through the gravedigger's brother, that the grounds were not to be profaned further. Borin spat in the mud when he heard that. Profaned, he muttered, as if they've any notion what the word means. He climbed the slope alone. The graveyard seemed emptier by daylight than it had by night, which was a feat in itself. Open graves slumped inward under hastily laid planks. Rainwater pooled in boot prints and coffin hollows. One mausoleum door hung crooked on its hinges, its lock snapped. Crows watched from headstones, but did not descend to peck. Even they knew better. The place had a hush to it that was not peace, but listening. Borin went first to the family tomb, where he had seen the corpse dragged below. Inside, the cracked stone floor had sunk at one end, the seams between the flags clogged with black mud. He knelt, planted both hands on the largest slab, and shoved. Nothing. He tried again, this time with the pry iron forced into the gap and his whole thick frame heaving behind it. Old mortar cracked. The slab groaned. Mud belched up from beneath with a smell like opened bowels. The flagstone lurched aside 3 inches. That was enough. He jammed the crowbar deeper, grunted through clenched teeth, and levered until the slab tilted up and over with a crash that echoed around the tomb like a cracked bell. Beneath was a shaft descending into wet darkness, its stone sides furred with slime and roots. The opening was wider than the charnel pit he had found the day before, and bore clearer signs of use. Finger gouges scarred the edge. Dark, greasy smears marked where bodies had been dragged through. One scrap of funeral cloth had caught on a chipped stone spur, grey-white and neatly hemmed. Not random scavenging, then. A root. Borin lowered the lantern and peered down. Stale air rose to meet him, thick with rot, old dust, and something else beneath it all. The rank animal musk of a den too long occupied. He heard dripping, far off perhaps, a small scrape, or imagined one. He tied the rope to a cracked sarcophagus and descended. The shaft opened into a narrow burial passage, cut from older stone than the church above. The masonry had the look of something built generations ago, back when Middenhoff Hollow, or whatever settlement stood here before, had coin enough to make proper chambers for its dead. Human work, but old enough for the edges to soften and the mortar to sweat pale salts. Niches lined the walls, many empty, some still filled with skulls and long bones stacked in priestly order. Others had been violated. Limbs were scattered. Rib cages burst open and rifled through as if marrow might still be hidden within. Black handprints marked the plaster in overlapping fans. Borin unshuttered the lantern a little more. Light crawled ahead into a passage turning right, then down by worn steps. He saw claw scoring on the lower walls where something had run its hands along the stone. Saw wet tracks in the dust where bare long-toed feet had passed only hours before. The tunnel was no natural cave, but the creatures had made it their own. Piles of gnawed bone and old ordure lay in the corners. The air was warmer below, close and foul, as if the earth itself were breathing through rotten teeth. He moved with care, placing each boot deliberately, listening after every third step. Dwarf kind were made for depths and dark work, though Borin had often felt that poets and priests romanticized the matter. There was nothing glorious about underground slaughter, only angles, echoes, stale air, and the certainty that everything approaching wished to put its hands inside you. The first chamber opened suddenly, on his left, a low ossuary with shelves from floor to ceiling, each once stacked with the dead of plague years. The bones remained in places, but not in order. Someone or something had arranged them into little heaps on the floor. At first glance, the mounds looked random. Then Borin saw the pattern. Shrines. Each pile had been built around a skull set upright and facing outward, jaw propped open by crossed finger bones. Vertebrae ringed them like crowns. Little pyramids of teeth sat before them, hundreds of them. Each tooth pushed point first into wax or dried fat so they stood in rows. Human teeth, child and adult mixed together. The lantern light made them shine wetly. In the mortar seams above the shrines, other teeth had been hammered into the wall in lines and spirals, not carefully, brutally. Some still held bloody roots. Borin's face hardened. Superstition, perhaps, or a marking system. Either way, it meant thought, ritual, some carrion mockery of religion. Wild ghouls did not decorate. He crouched by one of the wax mounds and touched it with the tip of his knife. Tallow, recent. Beneath the stink of rot lingered faint incense. His eyes narrowed. He rose and moved on. The passages became a maze as they deepened. Vault opened into corridor, corridor into half-collapsed stair, stair into old plague chamber where stacked biers had rotted into the floor. Water seeped from cracked ceilings. Roots punched through masonry in clutching fists. Twice he found bricked-up doorways that had been reopened from the other side by claw and patient labor. The old plaster, broken out from between stones and the gap, widened over months or years into something a crouched creature might slip through. They had not simply discovered these crypts. They had inherited them, worked them, expanded them like vermin nesting inside a granary wall until the structure itself belonged more to the infestation than its builders. He came next into a banquet hall for the dead. It had once been a noble vault of some kind, perhaps family-owned, with carved pillars and stone benches for mourners. Time had ruined all dignity in it. Coffins lay splintered and heaped in corners. The benches had been dragged into a rough circle around a central slab that served now as a table. On it were laid 3 corpses in varying stages of consumption. One was old enough to be mostly bone, the ribcage cracked wide, the skull chewed through at the temple. Another still wore part of a burial gown, though the belly had been opened and the organs scooped out. The third was fresher, fresh enough that the blood had not fully darkened. A man, middle-aged, wrapped in a church shroud tied neatly at the feet and throat. His cheek had been peeled back to the gums. One hand was missing. On his bare chest, someone had placed a small wreath woven from grave grass and finger bones. Borin's grip tightened on the axe haft. The arrangement was obscene, in a way mere feeding was not. He had seen greenskins pile heads into cairns, seen beastmen decorate trees with flayed skin. This had a colder nastiness to it. Performance. A mock feast set by creatures who dimly remembered halls and ceremonies and wished to parody them with carrion. He circled the slab and stopped at the fresh corpse. There was no dirt packed beneath the fingernails, no broken coffin wood in the wrappings. The knot at the throat had been tied by human hands, firm, square, practiced. Beneath the shroud, the flesh of the shoulders bore faint pressure marks, as though the body had been carried on a bier, not dragged through a tunnel. On the brow, someone had scrawled the black raven wing sigil, used by Moor's priests during funerary rites. This dead man had not been stolen from a grave. He had been delivered. Something moved then, a tiny scrape from the shadow behind the slab. Borin did not turn his head. He lowered the lantern slightly and listened. Another scrape. Then breath, fast and shallow, close to the ground. He whirled. A pale shape burst from under the stone table, on all fours, mouth yawning black and red, claws outspread for his belly. It was man-sized but too lean, all rope muscle and jutting joints, its spine humped, its face stretched into a long snout of teeth beneath lidless eyes. Bits of grave cloth hung from its shoulders. Its scalp was hairless save for patches of greasy down. It hit him with enough force to drive him a step back. Borin fired. From the hip, the pistol flash turned the chamber white. The shot took the creature in the side of the neck and blew out a fan of black blood and gristle. It shrieked, not like a beast, but like a starving woman, and thrashed at him even while dying. Borin dropped the empty pistol, caught one clawed wrist before it could rake his throat, and drove the axe edge down into its collarbone. Bone cracked. The thing collapsed, twitching, jaws snapping blindly at the floor. The echo of the gunshot rolled through the tunnels. Then came answering sounds from beyond the chamber, scrabbling, more than one set. Borin cursed, yanked the axe free, and kicked over the central slab. The three corpses slid to the ground in a wet heap as he backed toward the doorway. The second ghoul sprang from the right-hand pillar, almost silent, using the stone as cover, smarter than the first. It seized his lantern arm with both hands and bit at the wrist. He rammed the lantern itself into its face. Glass shattered. Burning oil splashed across its scalp and shoulder. Fire bloomed blue-orange. The creature shrieked and let go, clawing at its own flesh as the flames ran down its back. Borin hacked once, twice, taking off fingers, and then half the head. The corpse slammed into the wall and slid down, trailing fire. The tunnel beyond, filled with movement. They came low and fast, 3 more at least, perhaps 4, crowding the narrow approach. One leapt onto the wall and ran along it sideways for 3 strides like some monstrous spider before hurling itself at him. Borin snatched the second pistol and shot it mid-air. The ball punched through an eye and burst the back of the skull, showering the stones. It hit the ground, still twitching. The others did not pause. Borin retreated through the doorway, forcing the fight into the choke point. A dwarf could hold a narrow place against odds that would swallow a man. He set his boots. brought the axe across his body, and met the first attacker with a low sweep that severed both shins. The thing folded, screaming, and the one behind tripped over it. Borin stamped the fallen ghoul's head flat with one iron-shod boot, then head-butted the next hard enough to break its nose into pulp before burying the axe blade in its jaw and ripping upward. Black blood sprayed the wall. Hands clutched at him from the floor, nails screeching on his mail shirt. He felt one claw hook into the flesh above his knee and tear a strip free. Pain flared hot. He snarled and slammed the butt of the axe down like a hammer until fingers popped and the grip loosened. The tunnel behind the pack rippled with more yellow eyes. Too many. Borin stumbled back 2 steps and snatched the powder satchel from his belt. He ripped it open with his teeth, flung a fistful of black powder into the corridor, then hurled the remaining lantern oil after it. The nearest ghoul lunged, perhaps thinking him weaponless. Borin struck sparks from pistol flint to axe edge. The flash was instant. Fire punched through the confined passage with a booming cough. Not a proper blast, but enough. Flame sheeted over the powder cloud and rolled down the corridor. Ghouls shrieked in chorus. One came running through the fire, body alight, arms pinwheeling, and Borin split it from shoulder to sternum in a single furious chop. The others broke, vanishing into smoke and darkness with a chittering racket that set his teeth on edge. He stood panting, listening to them retreat. Not mindless, never mindless. They had tested him, pressed him, and then fallen back when the cost turned dear. Herding tactics: probe, distract, attack from angles, retreat through known routes. There was a hunter's intelligence in it, but not the clean instinct of wolves. Something uglier. A remnant of planning trapped inside carrion appetite. Borin wiped black blood from his beard and pushed deeper. He found more evidence as he went. A side vault where old noble dead had been pulled from sarcophagi and piled in a corner, while the chamber itself served as a sleeping den, the floor thick with matted gravecloth and filth. A narrow crawl passage widened by years of claw work into a thoroughfare linking 3 separate burial chambers. A hidden lookout slit cut behind a saint's effigy, through which yellow eyes might watch the lower crypt approaches unseen. And always the signs of generations, not seasons. Layers of refuse, successive wall scratchings. Bones long ago gnawed clean, then incorporated into new structures. This nest had not arrived last winter. It had been under Middenhoff Hollow for decades, perhaps longer, feeding in lean times, breeding in dark corners, surviving by caution and the blindness of men. In the deepest vault he discovered the proof that turned suspicion into something colder. It was a circular chamber, sunk below the plague pits, the air inside thick enough to chew. The walls were old brick, coated in white fungal bloom. Niches ringed the chamber, each holding little arrangements of bones and offerings, not random this time, but deliberate. Here a silver ring, threaded onto a child's finger bone. There a lock of hair, tied with mourning ribbon. In the center stood a stone bier, and upon it lay 6 wrapped bodies, side by side. They had not been mauled, not yet. Each corpse was shrouded in clean church cloth, marked with the raven's sigil of Maw. Their feet had been bound properly, their hands folded over the chest. At the head of each body sat a little saucer of tallow with a burned wick. Someone had even placed pennies over 2 of the closed eyes beneath the cloth, an old human custom for the unquiet dead. A delivery chapel. Borin's stomach turned, though little did that in him any more. He stepped close to the nearest shroud and pulled it back from the face. The dead woman beneath was gaunt but fresh, perhaps 2 days gone. No dirt, no coffin bruising, mouth sewn shut for burial by neat priestly stitches. On her throat he saw the livid mark of a cord. He uncovered the next. A boy of maybe 14, cheeks sunken, lips blue, dried blood at one nostril, fever dead at first glance, yet his wrists bore faint red abrasions hidden under the fold of the cloth, as if they had recently been tied. The third was an old man whose neck had been broken. Borin replaced the shroud slowly. His lantern light trembled over the chamber and caught writing scratched into the brick above the bier. Not words, tallies, short vertical marks scored in groups of 5, then crossed through, hundreds of them, layer over layer, old ones beneath new. Count of meals, count of offerings, it hardly mattered. The meaning was plain enough. Someone in Middenhoff Hollow had been feeding these things with care, not tossing corpses down a shaft in panic, but preparing them, blessing them, delivering them to appointed places like tribute paid to a lord beneath the earth. He heard movement then, not the rushing scrabble of an attack, but a slow crawl somewhere beyond the chamber wall, keeping pace with him. A watcher, perhaps several. Their claws clicked lightly on brick. Once one exhaled through its teeth, a sound almost like laughter. Borin turned toward it and spoke into the darkness. "I know then," silence answered. Then a voice came faintly through the wall. Not truly words, not speech a sane man would mistake for human conversation, but a shape of sound that had once belonged to language and now wore it like flayed skin. "More," it whispered. The brick beside him bulged as something leaned against it from the far side. "Soon." Borin snatched one of the tallow saucers from the bier and hurled it at the wall. It shattered. The unseen thing retreated with a hiss and a flurry of scrapes. He did not pursue. Not there. Not in the nest's deepest throat with his pistol spent and blood running warm into his boot. Instead, he backed from the delivery chamber step by careful step, axe raised, until the corridor widened enough for speed. Then he turned and climbed, following his own marks through the reeking maze, while things skittered in the dark beyond lantern range, stalking but not closing. Once, near the upper stair, one darted from a side niche and almost had him. It went for the injured leg, smart enough to smell weakness. Borin caught it by the back of the skull and smashed its face against the wall until teeth and stone chips rained down, then left it twitching in the filth. Another hurled a femur from the dark to break his lantern. He ducked by instinct and heard the bone crack against the ceiling where his head had been. Clever bastards, learning bastards. At last he reached the shaft beneath the family tomb and hauled himself up by rope and hatred. He emerged into cold afternoon rain, so hard and clean it felt like a blessing from some stern god of iron. For a long moment he stayed on his knees in the tomb doorway, breathing the wet air, while black cemetery mud washed ghoul blood from his hands in thin streams. Below the hill, Middenhoff Hollow lay dull and silent under the weather. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked and was instantly hushed. The town looked as poor and wretched as it had the day before, yet now Borin saw something fouler under the surface. Not just fear, complicity. A settlement that had survived by making arrangements in the dark and then teaching itself not to ask what became of the dead. He pushed himself upright, every joint aching. Under his boot sole something crunched. He looked down and found a bit of white lodged in the tread, a human tooth, driven there from the crypt floor. He scraped it off against the tomb threshold and stared toward the church. Someone had been feeding the nest on purpose, and from the scale of the offerings, they had been doing it for a very long time. Chapter 3. The Priest's Bargain. By the time Borin Clagson came down from the crypt hill, the rain had eased to a fine grey drizzle that made the whole of Middenhoff Hollow look drowned but not yet sunk. Water dripped from every warped eave and ran in brown ribbons down the rutted lanes. Smoke rose low from the chimneys, pressed flat by the weight of the sky. The town had the look of a man waiting to be struck in the face, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, every muscle tight with the expectation of pain. Borin walked through it with black blood dried in the seams of his gauntlets and a strip torn from his trouser leg, where one of the creatures below had raked him to the meat. He limped only slightly. A dwarf did not grant pain, the courtesy of public notice. People saw him coming, and knew at once that whatever lived under the graveyard was no drunken tale inflated in taverns. Women froze with slop buckets in hand. Men drawing water from the trough stepped away from the rope. A cooper setting hoops on a barrel stood staring, as if Borin had climbed out of the earth himself. None asked what he had found. The answer was written too plainly on him. He went straight to the Church of Moor. The doors were closed, but not barred. That told him something. A man who believed his God would protect him rarely thought first of bolts. Borin shoved one iron-bound leaf inward and entered with rain still steaming off his shoulders. Inside, the church was dim and cold despite the candles. Moor's black draperies hung motionless from the beams. Stone crows perched on ledges above funerary alcoves. The air smelled of damp wax, old incense, grave flowers gone to slime, and that underlying churchyard sweetness that had begun to poison the whole town. There were no mourners, no acolytes, only Father Halvard Voss, kneeling before the altar in black robes, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. He did not turn, as Borin's boots rang on the flagstones. "You should not have gone down there," Voss said. Borin stopped halfway up the aisle. "You should have said that yesterday. It'd still have been useless, but at least you'd have been punctual." The priest rose slowly. In candlelight he looked older than before, the skin around his mouth hanging loose with fatigue, the eyes sunk dark and bloodshot in their sockets. He had the face of a man who had not slept properly in years and no longer expected to. Yet there was no surprise in him, only a kind of sick resignation. Borin unhooked his satchel and let it fall to the church floor with a wet thump. It spilled a broken scrap of shroud and a blackened finger bone across the stones. "I found your offerings," he said. "Wrapped neat, blessed neat, laid out like supper in a chapel under the plague pits." Voss's jaw tightened. He looked not at the evidence but at the altar beyond it, as though appealing to the God who watched over the dead to ignore what one of his own servants had done among them. "You understand nothing of this place. I understand enough. The dead from the graves are one thing. Fresh bodies in church cloth are another. There's a route from your cemetery down into their nest, and someone has been using it with priestly care. So either you've The world's most devout grave robbers? Or this rot runs through your church?" Voss's mouth twitched. For a moment Borin thought he might deny it again. Lie, bluster, hide behind sanctity and ritual. That would have been easier. Easier to split him open and be done. Instead, the priest said, very quietly, "How many did you see? Enough. How deep did you go? Deep enough to learn your monsters can count." Something in Voss failed then. Not all at once, not with tears or dramatic collapse. It simply went out of him, like a lamp starved of oil. His shoulders sagged. His hands dropped from their prayerful pose and hung at his sides like dead things. "They were not always so many," he said. Borin's eyes narrowed. "Start speaking properly." The priest lowered himself onto one of the front pews as if his legs had forgotten their trade. Rain ticked faintly on the leaded windows. Somewhere high in the church rafters a crow, or something like one, stirred and resettled. "It began in the winter, after the stir crossing burned," Voss said. "Perhaps 12 years ago. Perhaps 13. The years are a smear here." He rubbed one hand over his face. "Soldiers had passed through. Not imperial regulars, levies, broken companies, deserters. Men with empty bellies and worse souls. They took what grain we had left after the autumn rot. Then came fever. Then 3 hard months of snow. We buried people in trenches because the ground was too stiff for individual graves." Borin said nothing. At first, the disappearances seemed part of it. In bad winters, the poor vanish. Drunks crawl into ditches and freeze. Beggars are found in spring under hedges chewed by foxes. A grave digger's apprentice did not come home. Then a widow. Then one of the charcoal burners from the edge of the woods. We told ourselves what frightened people always tell themselves. Wolves, bandits, rivermen, old curses. His voice flattened. Then I found what remained of a mourner behind the crypt wall. Half of him, his boots still laced. His face. Voss swallowed, and for an instant his composure cracked enough to show the memory beneath. They had eaten his tongue and eyes first. Borin crossed his arms. "So you tracked them." "I followed blood, down a collapsed charnel shaft. I was younger then, still foolish enough to mistake duty for strength." His gaze drifted toward the floor, seeing not church stones but older darkness far below. "I found the nest, smaller than now, still large enough to make a sane man despair. They watched me from the bones. They did not rush me. That was the horror of it. They watched. One came forward larger than the rest, hunched and ruinous, but with a face in which there remained echoes. Not humanity, not rightly, but memory of it. It spoke. The church seemed to grow colder. Borin had heard such things before, not often, and never with comfort. Some of the foulest creatures in the world still clung to language as to an old title they had no right to bear. "What did it say?" he asked. Voss gave a tired, bitter laugh. "That depends whether you care more for the words or the meaning. The words were broken nonsense, scraps of courtly speech rotted in the mouth. It called me shepherd, called the town above a granary, called its lair a hall. But the meaning was simple enough." He looked up. "Feed us the dead, and we will leave the living." Silence swelled between them. Borin let it hang a moment, then said, "And you agreed?" "Not at once. Of course not. Men like to circle their cowardice before lying down in it. Voss flinched but did not protest. They had already taken 17 by then, he said. Perhaps more. Mourners, wanderers, a girl gathering kindling, old men too slow to reach their doors before dusk. We had no garrison. No witch hunter would come for a village too poor to bribe one. The Count's taxmen came, but never his swords. I had 37 souls in town that winter, too weak to stand a beating, let alone fight. What would you have had me do? Ring the bell and lead them into the crypts with kitchen knives? I'd have had you tell the truth. To whom? Voss snapped, and for the first time real anger came into him, thin but sharp. To starving people who had begun locking children indoors before dusk? To men who would have fled into the marsh and died there? We live in Stirland, dwarf. The world does not send rescue because a priest writes a troubled letter. The world sends mud and fever and sometimes tax collectors. That is all. He stood abruptly, black robe, brushing the pew. I made a bargain, because the dead were already many, because paupers lay unclaimed, because thieves swung from the gibbet and no family asked for them, because plague pits have no mourners. I told myself that if carrion could purchase breathing time for the living, then perhaps Moore, who is no fool, would see necessity where men might see blasphemy. Borin stared at him. And did it work? Voss closed his eyes. Yes, he whispered. At first, the word at first hung in the church like a bad smell. Outside, there were voices now. Word traveled quickly in small towns, and panic quicker still. People were gathering by the church doors, muttering, boots scraping on wet stone. Borin had no need to glance back to know it. Voss heard them too. The disappearances stopped entirely. For 2 years not a soul was taken. They fed on the dead and kept below. Graves were disturbed now and then, but only those of the poor. I told the grave diggers to fill them in and keep silent. I told myself I had made the lesser peace. His laugh this time had no mirth in it at all. Do you know the filthiest thing, Master Dwarf? It even became practical. The town suffered fewer robberies at night because no thief dared linger near the cemetery. Wolves kept away. Men began to say Moore's Hill watched over us. Borin's lip curled. A fine guardianship. Then the years worsened, Voss said. War on the roads, refugees, bad harvests. More mouths than grain, more pauper funerals, more criminals from the gibbet. And still I could supply them. Still they kept to the bargain. He spread his hands slightly. So each season I found a new reason to endure it. Better the nameless dead than the baker's son. Better the condemned than the cooper's wife. Better one horror under the hill than 10 walking the streets. And then they multiplied. There it was, the core of it. Every compromise fattens itself. Voss's face went grey as old candle wax. 3 winters ago they began refusing the old corpses, unless something fresher lay among them. I found marks, messages scratched in bone, demands. He looked toward the altar again, perhaps because he could not bear to look at Borin. The dead from fever first, then those who died in debt, then those without kin. I drew lines and redrew them. Each time I told myself the next line would hold. The church doors banged open behind them. Cold daylight and wet voices flooded in. Magda Reeve strode up the aisle with half a dozen townsfolk behind her. The innkeeper Janik, the grave digger, and his brother, a one-eyed swineherd with a billhook, an old woman Borin recognized from a window, and two young men pale with the righteousness that comes only after terror has finally curdled into anger. They must have heard enough from outside, because no one wasted time asking. Magda looked from Borin to the priest and said, "Tell them." Voss straightened reflexively, priesthood rising in him like an old shield. "This is not—" "Tell them," she said again louder, "or I will." The church filled further. More faces at the threshold, more bodies in the nave, every one of them pinched and hollow-eyed, every one smelling of rain and cold wool and unwashed fear. Borin stepped aside. He had dragged truth into the light. What people did under it was their own trade. Voss's throat worked. "There was danger beneath the cemetery," he said at last. A bitter bark of laughter came from someone in back. "Was," shouted one of the young men. "Listen to the bastard." "It is danger still," Voss said, trying for authority and finding only fatigue. "Years ago I made an arrangement to spare the town greater suffering." "Arrangement," Magda repeated. "Say bargain. Say feeding." Murmurs turned sharp. Janik, the innkeeper, had gone white to the lips. The grave digger crossed himself and did not stop. Voss lifted both hands, as if calming mourners at a burial. The dead were given, the unclaimed, the paupers, those who would otherwise have gone into pits. In return, the creatures below left the living alone. "Except when they didn't," said Magda. The church grew still. She stepped forward until she stood almost shoulder to shoulder with Borin. Her voice did not rise, but it cut through the nave clean as a knife. "My sister's boy had the fever in spring," she said. "He was weak, aye, but he still knew his own name. Father Voss came with broth and poppy tincture, said the more sleep would ease his passing. By morning the boy was gone, and Voss said he'd died in the night and been taken for rites. Her eyes never left the priest's face. My sister was half mad and believed him. I did not. I went to the crypt door and found mud on the threshold and something dragged. A hiss ran through the crowd. Magda did not blink. There were others. Old Bren's daughter, called Fever Dead. Tilda Mauer's husband, called Apoplexy. A tramp from the road, bound at the wrists under his shroud when the river gave him back. You didn't only feed them the dead, Father. When the dead ran short, you helped make more." "No," Voss said sharply, then softer. "Not like that." "Then how?" His composure shattered. "How?" he barked, voice echoing under Moore's rafters. "How does rot spread? 1 inch at a time, one compromise after the next. A man dying anyway, a woman with no hope of waking, a criminal no one will claim. You think evil arrives horned and trumpeting? No. It arrives tired. It arrives hungry. It asks whether one more necessary sin might hold the dark at the door. And you opened the door instead," Borin said. That broke the crowd. Voices rose all at once. "Burn the crypts. Burn him first." "He saved us, damn you," cried someone near the back, a cracked old man with earth under his nails. "You think any of you would have lived those winters otherwise?" "Aye, and what then?" shouted another. "Keep feeding them? Pick lots for whose turn it is? Maybe we should. Better the useless than everyone." Hands went to knives. The swineherd brought up his billhook. One of the young men seized a brass candlestick like a club. The church, built for funerals and stern prayers, suddenly felt too small to contain so much pent-up dread. People jostled, spat, cursed. One woman began weeping noisily. Another screamed that her father had been buried on Moor's Hill and might by now be in some beast's belly. Father Voss stood in the middle of it all, not arguing anymore, only staring at the mob he had spent years deceiving and protecting and perhaps despising. Borin saw on his face the naked realization that truth once spoken did not cleanse. It merely gave the damned names. Magda turned to Borin. "Can the nest be burned?" "Aye," he said. "Everything burns if you've oil enough, and a mind to stand close while it catches. Then we burn it." "No." Voss lurched forward so suddenly, 2 townsfolk recoiled. "You don't understand. If you go blundering into those tunnels with torches and pitch, they'll come up everywhere at once. Crypt shafts, tomb floors, charnel pits. The whole hill is riddled beneath. Fire below may drive them above before it kills them." "Good," snarled the one-eyed swineherd. "Then we kill them above." "You?" Voss's laugh was almost hysterical. With farm hooks and grief, Borin stepped between them before the billhook found a throat. "Enough. They'll attack sooner now, whether you like it or not." That cut through the shouting more effectively than any priestly plea. He turned slowly, letting them all see the hard certainty in his face. "I went deep enough to find their feeding chambers, deep enough to be watched, leaving. They know I know. They know the bargain split. Creatures like that test weakness, but they don't wait forever once feeding is threatened. Tonight, maybe before, rain began again, tapping softly on the church windows. Someone whispered, 'Sigmar preserve us. This is Moor's house,' Voss said reflexively. 'No god is holding your walls for you,' Borin answered. 'Bolt doors if you like. It'll only make the slaughter tidier.' That got them moving. Panic with direction became labor. Men were sent for axes, hooks, lamp oil, spades, black powder from the quarry sheds. Women gathered children and elderly kin toward the stoutest buildings near the square. Tables were overturned for barricades. Window shutters were nailed closed. Even those who minutes earlier had muttered about preserving the bargain now did so with hands that shook. The town split along its fear, as it always had. Some said they must do as Borin urged and stand together with fire. Others whispered that perhaps Father Voss could still mend the arrangement, if humbled and allowed to speak with the things below. A few of the oldest would not meet anyone's eyes at all, which told Borin they had known more than they ever confessed. They had lived beside disappearances and fresh graves, and priests walking the hill after midnight, and chosen the comfort of ignorance over the cost of truth. By dusk, Middenhoff Hollow had become a camp awaiting siege. Borin set barrels of lamp oil near the cemetery gate, and assigned men with the steadier hands to powder horns and fuse cords. He had them drag cartloads of rubble to block the lower lane leading from the churchyard, should the creatures break that way. He placed spearmen farm pikes, really sharpened ash poles, at the narrow approaches between tombs where numbers might matter less. No one liked taking orders from a dwarf stranger until the first scream of twilight drifted down from the hill. Then they obeyed readily enough. The scream ended too fast to be human. Night crawled over the town. Clouds blotted what little moon there was. Rain came in ragged bursts, enough to slick stone and extinguish careless flames. Lanterns, hooded in tin, cast miserable pools of gold among the graves. The church bell rope hung still from the tower, black with wet. Borin stood at the cemetery gate, with axe in hand and pistols primed, breathing oil fumes and damp earth and the metallic promise of violence. Around him the townsfolk waited in clumps, trying not to tremble loudly. Father Voss had not fled. That Borin gave him. The priest stood near the church steps with a funeral torch and a sacramental blade better suited to cutting shrouds than monsters. His face looked carved from grave wax. Magda held a woodsman's axe, and nothing of prayer in her eyes at all. The first ghoul came up through old Martesen's grave. The earth burst outward in a wet cough. Rotting boards flew. A pale arm shot from the mud. Then another. Before the nearest pikeman could even shout, the creature hauled itself free and leapt, all teeth and grave filth. It hit the man chest high, drove him backward into a headstone, and tore his throat open in one savage rake. Blood sprayed across carved names and rain-dark lichen. Then the hill erupted. Tomb floors cracked. Mausoleum doors banged wide from within. A charnel shaft behind the church vomited 3 crouched shapes at once. Ghouls poured up from the cemetery, like corruption bursting through thin skin, long-limbed and slick with mud, their eyes catching lantern light in feverish yellow flashes. Some ran on all fours. Others loped half upright with a hideous mockery of human haste. One climbed a monument cross and sprang from it into the crowd, with its jaws already working. The graveyard became slaughter in a single heartbeat. Borin fired his first pistol and blew a ghoul backward off a mausoleum roof. Before the corpse had landed, he was moving, axe rising and falling in brutal red arcs. The first creature to meet him lost half its face. The second he split through the collar and drove into the mud under his boot. To his left, a barrel of lamp oil overturned and spread black across the grave path. Someone screamed for a torch. Someone else screamed because their hand was gone. The church bell began to ring. No human touched it. Borin looked once and saw a pale shape clinging to the inside of the spire, hauling the rope with both arms while it shrieked down at the fight below. The great bell boomed over the cemetery, each strike rolling through rain and panic alike, turning the whole slaughter ground into some blasphemous summons. "Fire!" Borin roared. A torch went into the spilled oil. Flame raced along the path in a sudden orange sheet, catching one ghoul mid-pounce and wrapping it in light. It ran burning between the graves, colliding with 2 of its own kind. Their shrieks rose high enough to cut through the bell. Men thrust with pikes. Women swung hatchets. More than one human died badly in the first rush, dragged down among broken headstones while the pack piled over them, tearing and gulping in wet jerks. A young man Borin had seen in the church smashed a creature's spine with a shovel and was rewarded a heartbeat later when another dropped on him from the crypt wall and bit through his cheek into his mouth. Magda fought near the gate like a butcher in an abattoir, both hands on the axe haft, chopping at wrists and necks with furious economy. One ghoul sprang low for her legs. She took its forearm off at the elbow and stamped its face into the mud until the skull burst like rotten fruit. All across the cemetery powder flashed. Borin had set the quarry lads with their charges near the weakest crypt mouths, and now they lit them one after another with shaking hands. The night boomed and coughed smoke. Stone burst outward. One mausoleum front collapsed in a shower of old masonry, burying 2 creatures and a screaming man with them. Another blast cracked open the churchyard path and vented a plume of hot, foul air from below, carrying with it the stink of the nest's deeper chambers. For an instant the ghouls wavered, unsettled by fire and thunder. Then a voice rose from the crypts beneath the bell, not loud, not human, yet somehow it spread through the graveyard even over rain, screams, and iron. A wet, cracked crooning of command. The creatures answered it at once. Their attack changed. No longer wild rushes, but coordinated strikes. Two drew men toward a tomb, while a third burst from behind. One feigned retreat limping, only to wheel when the swineherd pursued and lead him into an open grave, where waiting claws dragged him under. Another pack swarmed the church steps together, not to feed but to break entry. "They're herding!" Borin shouted, but most were too deep in terror to understand. Father Voss did. He stood white-faced in the torchlight, listening to that broken command from below, and whatever hope he still nursed died visibly in him. He looked not like a priest then, but a debtor hearing the creditor recite his full tally. The church doors burst inward as ghouls hit them from the outside and inside at once. More had come up beneath the nave. The bell rang and rang. Rain hammered the graves. Black powder flashed blue-white. Claws scraped stone. Men bellowed. Women cursed. And above it all the dead hill of Middenhoff Hollow vomited its long-fed horrors into the open night. No longer hiding, no longer bargaining, but claiming at last what had been owed. Chapter 4. The Midden King. By dawn, the graveyard no longer belonged to the dead. It belonged to crows, smoke, and butcher work. The rain had finally spent itself some time before first light, leaving Middenhoff Hollow under a sky the color of old iron. Mist lay low among the graves, snagging on cracked stones and broken crypt roofs. Black powder smoke drifted over the churchyard in filthy streamers. Fire still smoldered where lamp oil had run between tombs and pooled in hollows, turning the mud slick and rainbow-sheened. The church bell hung silent at last, though a split had opened along one side where some desperate fool had fired upward into the tower during the fighting. It swayed now and then in the wind with a dead, metallic ticking that set teeth on edge. Bodies lay everywhere, not neatly, not like men laid out for rites. They had been killed in all the ugly attitudes of panic and resistance, sprawled over headstones, wedged in broken grave plots, half submerged in the muck, where the cemetery paths had become trenches of blood and rainwater. Here, a man without a face. There, a woman still gripping the haft of a hatchet in hands that had been chewed down to the knuckles. 2 children found huddled in a mausoleum had survived the night, but their mother had not. She lay draped across the threshold, opened from shoulder to hip, as if some huge claw had sought to peel her apart. Among the dead lay the things that had killed them. Ghouls in dozens, smashed, burned, headless, dismembered, their pale hides blackened by fire, their long fingers still hooked in the grass and stone, where they had died trying to crawl farther. Some had fallen with human flesh still between their teeth. Others had been blasted apart so thoroughly that only limbs and greasy gobbets of meat proved what they had once been. The cemetery stank of old graves, fresh blood, lamp oil, and the high sweet taint of opened viscera. It smelled like a slaughter yard built in a charnel pit. Borin Clarkson stood near the broken church steps, with dried blood on his beard rings, and a bandage knotted tight around his thigh. He had not sat since the fighting ended, had not eaten, had barely blinked. His eyes moved over the wreckage with the hard, depth-trained stare of one measuring not only what had happened but what still might. The graveyard had spewed up far more than he would have believed if he had not fought them himself. Yet even now he knew the count above ground was not the whole of it. Tunnels ran beneath the hill like rot through a tooth. The ghouls had come up in waves, yes, but not all at once. Some had broken and fled the moment the flames spread. Some had retreated below, carrying pieces of the dead with them. The nest still lived. Magda Reeve came limping through the smoke with a strip of blood-soaked cloth wound around one forearm. Dried gore flecked her face. Her widow's wool had been hacked nearly to ribbons, and one boot was missing its sole. But she moved with the raw grimness of a thing too angry to properly register pain. "How many standing?" Borin asked without turning. 32, if you count the old enough to hold a spear. Fewer, if you count only those likely to stand where they're told. She spat into the mud. "Half the town's dead, or ripped up?" Borin grunted. That sounded about right. "What of the priest?" Magda glanced toward the church porch. Father Halvard Voss sat on the step beneath a soot-blackened Morite carving, elbows on knees, blood down one sleeve. He had fought in the end. That much was plain. The sacramental blade lay snapped beside him. One side of his face was clawed open from temple to jaw, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to ruin. He stared at nothing. Men did that when they survived the proof of their own sins. "He's alive," Magda said, "against good judgment." Borin turned and finally looked at the priest. "Can he still walk?" "He can still kneel." "Close enough." Borin nodded once. "Then we finish it today." That brought a silence that seemed, for a moment, to deepen the whole ruined graveyard. Several townsfolk within earshot stopped their work. One of the quarry lads who had spent the night handing out powder stared as if Borin had suggested digging up the moon. The gravedigger's brother muttered a prayer. Even Magda, who had spent most of the dark hours killing anything that came within reach, looked at him with something like disbelief. "We just survived hell," she said. "No," Borin answered. "You survived the mouth of it. The guts are still below." He pointed with the haft of his axe toward the broken crypts and split tomb floors from which the creatures had poured. Smoke drifted lazily from several openings. Beneath one collapsed mausoleum slab, something moved weakly and then went still. "If we leave the nest, it breeds again, feeds again. Maybe not this month, maybe not this winter. But rot doesn't cure by hiding the smell. It settles deeper." His eyes hardened. "You want your dead dug up for the next 20 years, do you?" No one answered, because no one had an answer that would let them go back indoors and pretend the world was merely cruel in ordinary ways. So they gathered what remained, a ragged handful only. Borin would have preferred dwarfs with tunnel sense and iron discipline, but the world had not seen fit to leave those in Middenhoff Hollow. Instead he got Magda Reeve with her butcher's temper, the one-eyed swineherd called Keller, who had lost 2 sons in the night and looked hollow enough to volunteer for anything suicidal, Janik the innkeeper, pale and shaking but stubborn under it, 2 quarry lads with blistered hands and a satchel of blasting powder between them, and Father Voss, who rose when called with the stiff obedience of a condemned man walking to the block. The rest of the town barred doors, dragged the wounded into whatever shelter still had a roof, and watched from windows as the little party crossed the cemetery once more. No one cheered them. This was not the sort of work that inspired heroics. It inspired the sour, guilty silence of survivors, grateful someone else was walking toward the dark. They entered through the shattered church undercroft, because the ghouls had cracked it wide in the night, and the opening was broad enough to carry powder. The nave above still smelled of blood and trampled wax. Beneath it, the stairs spiraled down into damp stone and old air, each step slick with mud tracked by clawed feet. Borin went first with a hooded lantern in one hand and axe in the other. The others followed in single file, breathing too loudly. No one spoke much. Tunnels did that to humans, stole language out of them, and left only the wet noises of fear. The deeper they went, the thicker the stink became. Not merely death now, but habitation. Midden piles, animal heat trapped in old crypt chambers, rotting cloth, corpse fat. Once, passing a side passage half blocked by fallen bones, they heard something inside shift and gnaw. Janik nearly dropped his torch. Borin did not investigate. A hunter with a nest below his boots did not lunge after every sound, like a village idiot after rustling hedges. The heart mattered. The rest could die in the collapse. They moved through chambers Borin had already seen, though daylight memory made them no kinder. The tooth shrines glittered in the lantern glow. The mock banquet room still stank of burned ghoul flesh, where one of the earlier skirmishes had blackened the walls. Corpses pulled from graves lay gnawed and rearranged in fresh obscenities, as if the creatures had made sport of the night's dead while their kin fought above. Here a child's arm threaded through a jawbone garland, there a grave digger's cap nailed to a pillar with sharpened finger bones. Keller crossed himself and whispered, "More, keep us." More had his chance, Magda said. Father Voss flinched, but said nothing. The tunnels changed as they descended farther than Borin had gone before. The masonry grew older, cruder in places, then stranger, as though newer burial crypts had been hacked downward into something more ancient and less pious. There were long stretches where the walls were not built, but carved directly through compact earth veined with roots and old coffin wood. In others, the brickwork bore faded reliefs of forgotten dead, faces long eroded into eyeless masks. The ghouls had defaced them all, teeth hammered into eye sockets, skull fragments mortared over saintly mouths. One ancient lord's stone effigy had been gnawed entirely from the waist down. They began to find the drag trails, fresh ones. Bodies or pieces of bodies had been pulled this way after the night's slaughter. Boot heels scored the mud. A severed hand lay in a corner, wedding ring still on. The quarry lads both saw it and looked away at once. Borin did not need to ask whether they recognized it. "They're feeding," he said. That was answer enough. Soon after, the first attack came, not from the front, never from the front, if the pack could help it. A side wall collapsed in a coughing spill of loose brick and pale limbs. Two ghouls burst through the gap shoulder to shoulder, more grey with age than the younger ones above, their hides hanging in folds over wiry muscle, their mouths red to the ears. Borin's axe took the first in the throat before it had properly found its footing. The second went low for his legs, but Magda stepped in hard and drove a woodsman's spike down through its back. The creature shrieked and twisted, nearly wrenching the tool from her hands. Keller finished it by smashing its skull with a mattock. The sound of the blows rolled down the tunnel. Then came answering clicks in the dark beyond lantern range. Many of them. A whole chatter of hard nails on stone. "Move," Borin snapped. "Don't stop to admire the workmanship." They moved. Behind them the sounds multiplied. not charging yet, herding, pressing, a constant ghostly accompaniment of footfalls and scrapes from adjacent passages and hidden vents. The nest knew its own body. It knew where intruders walked within it. Borin felt it with increasing certainty. Not merely a den now, but a domain shaped over years by creatures that retained just enough reason to build systems, routes, ambush points. A carrion court under the hill. They reached a broad descending passage slick with greasy runoff. The floor there was worn smooth by traffic, and the walls bulged outward as if whatever tunnel this had once been had been widened repeatedly by claw and toil. A warm draught breathed up from below, carrying the overpowering stench of the central Midden. Not one carcass, not 10. A mountain of years. Borin halted and gestured the others close. "This is the throat," he said. "Below's the heart." The younger quarry lad swallowed audibly. "How many?" Borin looked down into the dark. "Enough." He divided the powder quickly. One satchel for the main cavern, if they could reach a proper load-bearing point. Smaller horn measures for choke passages behind them. If they had to retreat, he meant to bury pursuit in stone and dirt. The lads nodded, faces white and sweaty in the close air. Their courage was the ugly, functional kind, born of having no cleaner option. Father Voss spoke then for the first time in many minutes. "If it is truly what I think it is, the one below, then fire alone may not." Borin rounded on him. "You'll save your wisdom for when it stops stinking of 12 years' cowardice." The priest took the words without flinching. That, more than any plea, revealed how far gone he was within himself. They descended. The passage spilled them at last into an enormous cavern that might once have been a natural sinkhole beneath the crypts, later broken into and enlarged by burials, collapses, and monstrous labor. It swallowed the lantern light whole. The ceiling hung high overhead in ragged darkness webbed with roots and hanging scraps of ancient coffin wood. The floor fell away in terraces of bone, and refuse arranged around a central depression where an old sepulchre, perhaps the core of the first burial mound here centuries ago, sat sunken like a throne at the bottom of a pit. Everything else was Midden. Heaps upon heaps of dead consumption, bones piled chest-high and shoulder-high, in white drifts streaked brown and black, gnawed skulls by the hundreds, some split for brains, some hollowed and stacked, grave clothes in mouldering masses, rusted jewelry, broken icons, rosaries, bent coffin nails, human hair in damp ropes, wax drippings, gobbets of corpse fat smeared over stones like grease. The place glistened in the lantern light, as if varnished in old rot, and among it all moved the nest. Dozens, perhaps more. Ghouls crouched on the mounds like vultures at a battlefield, some feeding, some watching, some nursing wounds from the night before. Smaller ones scuttled between larger hulks carrying scraps of flesh. One sat atop a cairn of rib cages, cracking finger bones between its teeth with absorbed delight. Another worried at the face of a corpse, still wearing the remains of a town militiaman's coat. The sounds were endless and intimate. Chewing, sucking, claw scrape, wet swallowing. The occasional sudden bark of aggression as one beast cuffed another away from a prize. Then the feeding stopped. Heads turned. Yellow eyes flowered across the Midden. At the center, in the sunken sepulchre, something vast unfolded. Old hunger rose from a bed of bones and funeral tatters like a bloated king waking on his throne. He had once perhaps centuries before, been a strigoi, one of those debased vampire horrors whose courts had festered in ruins and crypts before the hammer of history broke them. What remained of that ancestry was not nobility but its corpse memory. He was huge, easily a head taller than any man even stooped, shoulders broad as a door, limbs too long and knotted with diseased muscle, beneath skin the color of old wax, stretched over bruised flesh. His belly was swollen, not with softness but with the obscene distension of a scavenger gorged past sense. His chest and arms bore patches of old scar tissue and fresh gore. His face was a ruin of predatory degeneration. Flattened nose, cavernous mouth, tusk-like teeth jutting through split lips, eyes sunk deep and amber-bright with malice. Around his throat and brow hung trophies, scraps of funeral gold, finger rings threaded on sinew, vertebrae strung like courtly chains, a child's silver burial circlet crushed and twisted into a mock crown over his bald pate. He leaned one huge hand on the cracked stone lip of the sepulchre and smiled with the revolting ceremony of a host greeting guests. When he spoke, the words came in a broken, wet version of old courtly Rakespiel, each syllable dragged through a throat made for feeding more than speech. "Ah," he crooned, "little stone lord, back again. Bring candles, bring lambs." No one moved. Old Hunger's nostrils flared. He sniffed the air over them, and his grin widened. Priest also, good priest, thin now, sad now. Father Voss had gone the color of ash. Borin stepped forward one pace, planting his boots in the filth. "You've eaten your last under this hill." Old Hunger's head tilted. Then, with hideous parody, he spread both arms as if presenting the cavern around him. "Your hill?" he said. No, man hill, priest hill, fear hill, all fed, all gave." He touched his own chest with one clawed finger. "You make fat, you bury, you hide, we feast." The ghouls around him chittered and shifted. Not mindless pack noise now, but something disturbingly close to amusement. Old Hunger licked blood from one wrist. Men always feed. Cowards, priests, mothers, reeves. One dead, two dead. Better underground, yes. Better not hear chewing. Magda spat toward him. "I'll hear yours soon enough." "You!" He looked at her and showed his teeth. "Sharp widow. Smells of rage. Good meat." Then he moved his gaze to Father Voss, and something uglier passed across his face, a kind of affectionate contempt. "Priest, bring wrapped gifts," he said softly. "Priest, sing sleep song. Priest, cry after. Good priest." That did it. Father Voss made a sound Borin had not heard from him before. Not prayer and not speech, but the ragged noise of a man watching his soul held up in public by the creature he had tried to placate. He lurched forward 2 steps, clutching a torch in one hand and a satchel of oil in the other. "I should have burned you years ago," he whispered. Old Hunger laughed, and the sound rolled through the Midden cavern like wet stones tumbling down a well. "Yes," he said. "Should have." Then the nest came down on them. The side mounds erupted first. Ghouls launched themselves from above in pale arcs, teeth bared, claws spread for faces and throats. Borin met the first mid-leap with an upswing that split it from groin to sternum. The second hit him hard enough to drive him knee-deep into a drift of bones. He dropped the lantern, caught its wrist as claws slashed for his eyes, and head-butted it with all the ugly mass of a dwarf made for tunnel war, Bone cracked. He tore his axe free and buried it in the creature's side, then kicked the corpse off the mound. To his right, Keller and Janik fought back to back beside one of the powder satchels. Keller's mattock crushed a ghoul's jaw to splinters, while Janik jammed a kitchen knife repeatedly into another's neck with the blank horror of a man who had crossed too far into survival to stop. One of the quarry lads lit a short fuse on a horn charge and flung it into a cluster, scrambling down a skull heap. The blast punched bone fragments and black blood into the air in a storm. Magda drove straight downhill toward Old Hunger through the chaos, hacking left and right with blood-crazy ferocity. One ghoul caught her shoulder from behind and rode her for 3 strides, biting. She slammed backward into a pillar of stacked coffins until its spine broke with a wet snap, then kept going. Father Voss did not rush the patriarch. Instead, he staggered toward the central sepulchre and began hurling oil onto the corpse-fat drifts around it, splashing the sides of the pit, the piled grave clothes, the waxy surfaces where years of Midden had built a skin over everything. His mouth moved in prayer, or madness, perhaps both. 2 smaller ghouls leapt at him. He thrust the torch into one's face and sent it up shrieking, then took the other across the ribs with the broken sacramental blade so hard the fragment snapped off inside the thing's chest. Borin saw it all in flashes between impacts and blood. The fight turned into a running slaughter across the bone terraces. There was no line to hold, no formation possible. Only little knots of desperate violence among heaps of the eaten dead. Lanterns shattered. Fire spread in greasy threads wherever oil touched Midden. Smoke thickened low and foul. Ghouls vanished behind mounds and came again from impossible angles. Twice Borin saw one deliberately drive a screaming townsman toward a hidden drop so another below could seize the legs and drag the victim under. The younger quarry lad lasted longer than Borin expected. Then 3 ghouls took him together near a mound of jawbones. He disappeared beneath pale limbs and flailing claws, and when Borin hacked his way close enough to reach him, there was already too little left to rescue. Old Hunger watched the melee from the sepulchre rim for several heartbeats, choosing. Then he launched himself with terrifying speed for something so massive. He came not at Borin first, but at Father Voss. The priest barely had time to turn before the patriarch hit him. They went down among the oily grave cloths in a tangle of black robe and monstrous muscle. Voss screamed once as claws punched through his shoulder. Old Hunger pinned him with one hand and bent low, maw opening over the priest's face like a trap. "You fed well," he whispered. Then Borin was there. He hit Old Hunger in the side with both hands on the axe haft, the blade biting deep just below the ribs. The impact jarred his arms numb. The patriarch roared and backhanded him so hard he cartwheeled through a drift of skulls and slammed shoulder first into a pillar of bones. White fragments avalanched over him. His ears rang. For one blurred moment all he could see was the grin of empty sockets. He spat blood, surged upright, and found Old Hunger coming again. At close quarters the patriarch was even worse than size alone suggested. He fought with the feral savagery of a ghoul and the spiteful cunning of something far older. He feinted left, then raked right with claws, long as carving knives. He used the terrain, kicking piles of bones under Borin's feet, driving him toward greasy slopes. He bit not wildly, but where armor gapped, one tusk scraped sparks off Borin's mail collar and punched into the meat beneath his jaw, hard enough to send him reeling. Borin answered like a dwarf, by refusing all elegance and making the exchange ruinously expensive. He stepped inside a sweeping claw, let it tear the leather from his upper arm, and hammered the axe pole into Old Hunger's knee with a crack like splitting timber. As the patriarch lurched, Borin drew his last pistol from his belt and fired point-blank into the thing's open mouth. Teeth and black gore exploded from the back of Old Hunger's head in a foul spray. The patriarch staggered, but did not fall. Vampire blood, however degraded, was a hard thing to silence. The sepulchre pit around them was burning now. Father Voss, half crushed and drowning in his own blood, had managed to kick his torch into the oil-soaked midden before collapsing. Flame climbed the corpse fat in hungry tongues. Grave clothes caught. Wax flared. The whole central depression began to burn with a thick, greasy fire that threw light up the cavern walls and made the skull heaps seem to grin. "Powder!" Borin roared. "Set the damn powder!" The surviving quarry lad, alone now, soot-black and wide-eyed, stumbled toward the main load with Janik at his heels. A ghoul leapt onto Janik's back and bit through his neck before the innkeeper had taken 2 steps. He went down kicking, fingers still clutching fuse cord. The lad froze. Magda appeared out of smoke and hacked the ghoul off Janik's corpse in one 2-handed blow. "Run, you little fool!" she screamed at the lad, and shoved him bodily toward the cavern wall where Borin had marked the load-bearing crack. He ran. Old Hunger lunged through the fire, burning now along one shoulder, the mock crown of funeral gold glowing dull red against his scalp. He hit Borin like falling masonry. The axe was wrenched from Borin's grip. Both went over the sepulchre edge, into the burning refuse below. Borin landed on his back, in liquefying fat and charred cloth. The wind smashed from him. Old Hunger crashed atop him, one massive hand closing on his throat, the other digging into his mail as if trying to peel the iron away. Around them the cavern dissolved into screams, fire, and the thump of more fighting too scattered to pass. Old Hunger's ruined mouth hovered inches from Borin's face, smoking blood drooling over broken teeth. "Little stone lord," he rasped. All same below. Borin's vision narrowed. His right hand groped in the burning muck and found not his axe, not a knife, but a shattered human femur sharpened by gnawing. Good enough. He drove it up through Old Hunger's left eye. The patriarch convulsed. Borin bucked with all the black fury left in him and rolled free as the creature clawed at the bone embedded in its socket. Borin came up half-blind with smoke, found his axe where it lay among burning skulls, and seized it just as the powder fuse hissed somewhere beyond the fire. The quarry lad had done it. Old Hunger lurched upright again, one hand over the ruined eye, the other spread wide for balance. Even now it might have survived another minute, another 10. Horrors such as this did not die promptly out of courtesy. Borin gave it no such chance. He charged uphill through the flames, boots slipping in liquefying fat, and hit the patriarch at the neck with a full-bodied dwarf's execution stroke. The axe bit through vertebrae already weakened by pistol-shot shock and years of corruption. Old Hunger's head went half free. Borin ripped the blade out and struck again. This time the thing's great crowned head tore loose entirely and tumbled down the burning sepulchre steps, trailing black blood and loops of tendon. The body stood an instant more, spurting, then collapsed into the fire. A heartbeat later the powder went off. The cavern became thunder. The load-bearing wall behind the central midden burst inward in a rolling detonation that shattered old masonry, snapped root columns, and sent half the ceiling downward in a roaring cascade of dirt, stone, bones, and ancient coffin wood. Ghouls vanished under it. Fire belched sideways with the force of a forge blast. The ground heaved under Borin's boots. Magda was thrown flat. Father Voss, still somehow alive near the sepulchre edge, disappeared beneath a falling slab of carved stone without even a cry. "Out!" Borin bellowed, though whether anyone could hear him in that deafening ruin he did not know. They fled, not nobly, not in order. They scrambled like rats from a sinking ship, half blinded by dust and smoke, while the nest tore itself apart behind them. Tunnels collapsed in sections. Side chambers caved in. Ghouls, maddened by fire and crushing earth, lunged through the choking dark at anything that moved. Keller brought them 10 more yards when he turned at a choke point and held off 3 of the creatures with his mattock until a falling beam smashed both him and them flat. Magda dragged the quarry lad by the collar when terror rooted him in place at the sight of a wall buckling inward. Borin took 1 more ghoul in the stair-throat, burying his axe in its skull and ripping the corpse clear before the next collapse buried them all. At last cold air hit them. They erupted from the undercroft into the church nave just as the floor behind them split and sagged. Then they were out the doors and into the cemetery, stumbling through smoke and morning mist, while the whole crypt hill began to sink. It did not explode upward dramatically. That would have been too grand. It sagged in ugly stages, tomb by tomb, patch by patch, as hidden supports failed below. A mausoleum tipped and vanished nose first. 3 rows of graves folded inward as if some giant fist pressed from beneath. The church itself gave one great groan and lost its tower, the cracked bell plummeting through the roof in a crash that sent crows boiling into the sky. Dust and ash rolled out over the hill. Fire licked through the new fissures where hot gases vented from below. Within minutes, the cemetery of Middenhoff Hollow had become a smoking sinkhole. The survivors stood in the mud below and watched it settle. There were not many of them. Magda, Borin, the last quarry lad sobbing so hard he could barely stand. Janek was dead below. Keller was dead below. Father Voss was dead below, along with whatever hope he had ever nursed of balancing evil against necessity and coming away clean. Of the town, nearly half were gone by rough count. Houses stood open to grief. The Church of Moor, which had watched over generations of burials, now leaned cracked and broken over the edge of a pit full of the fed and the feeders alike. No one said the town was saved. Not at first. Men were too busy finding who was left to bury. By afternoon, the smoke had thinned enough for Borin to collect his due. It came from 6 shaking hands, in pennies, old silver, a brass brooch, and 1 tiny gold tooth pulled from some widow's hidden purse. Less than he would have charged for bandits on a good road, more than the ruin around him could honestly spare. He took it anyway. Mercy and hunger made poor business partners. Magda walked with him as far as the edge of town, where the south road dissolved into wet ruts between the marsh reeds. She had changed her torn wool for another black dress, not much better, and bound her wounded arm properly. Her face looked older than it had 2 days ago. "We'll have to bury them in the fields now," she said, not looking at him. "Not on the hill." Borin adjusted the strap of his pack. "Bury them deeper." She gave a hard, humorless snort. "You think that helps?" "No," he said, "but it helps men feel industrious." That almost made her smile. Behind them, Middenhoff Hollow hunched under its smoke. The broken church bell had been dragged from the wreckage and lay on its side in the square like the shell of some dead iron beast. Crows already lined the cemetery sinkhole rim, despite all the shouting meant to drive them off. Magda stopped. You were right about one thing. Only one? Men did this as much as the monsters. Borin looked back once at the town, at the women scrubbing blood from door stones, at the men carrying wrapped bodies to improvised pyres because there was no intact graveyard left, at children staring too silently from windows where they would never again trust dusk. He thought of Father Voss kneeling in his church explaining necessity, thought of the delivery chamber below, thought of old hunger crooning that men had made him fat. Aye, he said, that's the trouble with nests. They like dark holes. Men are forever digging them. He left without blessing and without farewell. The road south wound through low marsh ground where reeds whispered in the wind and the earth sucked at boots. By dawn the next morning, he was a mile from town, following the raised track between black pools filmed with scum. Mist hung over the water in torn bands. Frogs had not yet begun their spring racket. The whole marsh seemed to listen. Behind him, faint and small with distance, came the sound of Middenhoff Hollow beginning another day over its dead. Ahead, from somewhere off the road, came a child's voice. Borin turned his head. On a hummock of sedge above the marsh stood one of the town's little ones, a girl, perhaps 6 years old, in a man's old coat cut down to fit. She should not have been out there alone. She stared not at him, but at the ground near her boots. Borin went to her, with a curse already forming. The hummock had cracked along one side where the marsh bank met older, buried stone. Reeds drooped over a narrow opening, no wider than a coffin lid set askew. Damp air breathed from it, warm and foul against the cold morning. At the lip lay a fragment of gnawed bone newly wet with saliva. The child pointed down into the dark. Borin stood very still. At first he heard only marsh water dripping. Then, from far below, patient and unhurried, came the sound of chewing.